Shalom, everybody. We're in the 31st chapter of Ezekiel. You turn there. We're going to pick up kind of where we left off last week. Last week we were in the 11th year after the beginning of the second giving of prophecy in his ministry. Now we're also still in the 11th year. But that's where the chapter break took place, so that's where we stopped. Kind of like in the earlier message, I was talking in Genesis about the poor choice of where the chapter break goes. I know they have to put them somewhere, but I wish they would put them in a place that kept time periods together, prophecies together, that sort of thing. So in the 11th year, on the first day of the third month, the word of Yehovah came to me. I shouldn't have to say this. You probably all know it. Anybody who's listening to the series online should know that we're talking about, when we say the word of Yehovah, we're talking about Mashiach in a pre-incarnate form has come to him to give him a message. It says, "O mortal." You notice never once does he call him Ezekiel? That just occurred to me when I was studying on it, preparing for this particular message. Never once in the entire book can I find a time where Mashiach comes to him and says, "Ezekiel, I have a message for you to give to the people." He says, "O mortal." I'm not exactly sure what that means, what the significance of that is, but I'm sure there is one. I'm going to be studying on it. Hopefully by the time we get to the end of this series, I will have something concrete to give you. He calls him, "O mortal." It says, "Say to Pharaoh, king of Mitzrayim, and his hordes." Now, up to this time, we've mainly looked at messages to kings. Now, early on, it was messages to the people of Israel, the Yahudim, so forth. But when it got into speaking to other nations, mainly basically what we've been seeing is tell the king of this land, and tell the king of that land, and tell the king of the other land. But here it says, "Say to Pharaoh, king of Mitzrayim, and his hordes." Who was comparable to you in greatness? Assyria was a cedar in Lebanon, with beautiful branches and shady thickets, of lofty stature, with its top among the leafy trees. Waters nourished it. The deep made it grow tall, washing with its streams the place where it was planted, making its channels well up to all the stress of the field. All the trees of the field. Therefore it exceeded in stature all the trees of the field. Its branches multiplied and its boughs grew long, because of the abundant waters that welled up for it. In its branches nested all the birds of the sky. All the beasts of the field bore their young under its boughs, and in its shadow lived the great nations. Now, anytime we see a nation compared to something else, we have to think about the nature of what is compared to, and compare it to the nature of what was actually happening to that nation. Here, Mitzrayim and its hordes, which could mean Pharaoh's immediate followers and his court, or it could mean, and I believe this is what it means, that it's referring to other kings that were subservient to him. Vassal kings, like the king of Assyria that's mentioned here. And when it talks about its roots were nurtured and then it grew branches, I believe those branches were vassal kings put in other nations. when it talks about the mighty waters that were at its roots, that fed it, one of the strengths, one of the things when we see many waters anywhere in prophecy, we're talking about multitudes of peoples. Okay? Many streams coming together can be many people groups coming together. When we talk about the sea, the vastness of the sea in a prophecy, we're usually talking about a collection of nations. Okay? So here we talk about the waters that fed it, and the boughs grew out over it. And if you think about Mitzrayim or Egypt at the time, it was kind of, not to the extent that the United States is, but it was kind of like the United States in that it was a melting pot. If you think about it, when Yaakov came and his 70 people came into, that he had with him, came into Mitzrayim, it was already a melting pot. Okay? Because people had been taken as slaves from other countries, or had come fleeing famine, or fleeing refugees from wars, had come in from Mitzrayim for shelter, and they had kind of planted themselves there. And so long as they swore a fidelity oath to Pharaoh, he didn't care where they came from. He didn't care where Yusuf's people came from, other than he's like, where should I put them? Where should I have them live? And Yusuf said, well, since their youth, what they've done is they've been shepherds, so why don't we put them in Goshen? And Pharaoh said, okay. So many nations had fed Mitzrayim, its people, to the point that when different dynasties reigned in Mitzrayim, it was hard to even know if that dynasty was really Egyptian. That's going to play an important part when we get to the end of this chapter. Okay? Were they Mitzrayim? Were they somebody else? Kind of like there's a guy sitting next to the Queen of England right now. His name is Prince Philip. Is he British? English? Welsh? Scottish? Irish? What is he? None of the above. He's Greek. He's a Grecian prince. And some people call the queen the pretender queen, because if you look at her ancestry, she's actually more French than anything from the Isles. She claims her royal line her right to rule Great Britain. She claims through a Scottish line, but it's actually the minority of her bloodline. And yet she's the Queen of England and Great Britain and the Empire and whatever other title she claims. And that happened a lot in Mitzrayim. But the empire just kept getting bigger and bigger, and those branches kept spreading out. And we see the picture of the lesser peoples. You know, they come and the birds come and they make nests in the boughs of the trees, but then they fly away and they leave, and the nests are still there, and the tree just keeps getting bigger, and more birds come. We see the animals of the field being birthed under them, under those same branches. We see the nations under the branches. It was beautiful in its height, in the length of its branches, because its stalk stood by abundant waters. Cedars in the garden of Elohim could not compare with it. Cypresses could not match its boughs. The plane trees could not vie with its branches. No tree in the garden of Elohim was its peer in beauty. I made it beautiful. You know what's that? I. This is Mashiach speaking on behalf of Elohim. Yeshua on behalf of Yehovah, saying, I made it beautiful. That's where the Pharaoh tended to go wrong, if you look at the history. He tended to say, I am a god, I am descended from the gods, I worship other gods, and I, with my gods, made this empire great. The Mashiach says, I made it beautiful. In the profusion of its branches, and all the trees of Eden envied it in the garden of Elohim. So he says, early on, I began to make this people great. I began to make this people mighty. And we have to ask, why? Why would the creator of the universe make a people other than his chosen people great? I think of a number of reasons. Some scholars say, well, it's because he needed them to be the execution warhammer. He needed them either to protect Yisrael, or he needed them to correct Yisrael. Well, Yisrael never really needed anybody to protect them. They had Elohim. But they often needed somebody, and we still often need someone to correct us. And so I see some validity in that argument, but I believe there was more to it than that. Assuredly, thus said Yehovah Elohim, because it towered high in stature and thrust its top up among the leafy trees, and it was arrogant in its height, I delivered it into the hands of the mightiest of nations. Because you thought too much of yourself, you fell. They treated it as befitted its wickedness. I banished it. Strangers, the most ruthless of nations, cut it down and abandoned it. Its branches fell on the mountains, and in every valley its boughs were splintered in every watercourse of the earth, and all the peoples of the earth departed from its shade and abandoned it. What does Jeremiah say? Yirmiyahu, what does he say at the beginning of Lamentations? Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Earlier I compared Mitzrayim then to the United States now. This is coming. I think we came dangerously close when our previous president took all support away from Israel. I think we were teetering right on the edge. And I'm not going to say that our current president is the greatest leader we've ever had. By far, he is not. But one thing that he does seem to have is a love for the people of Elohim. He has vowed to protect the land at all costs. He has vowed to help us to have a homeland forever. He has vowed to place the embassy back in Jerusalem, and he did so. And he witnessed his daughter make a vow to become one of Elohim's people, and he consented to it. Does that make him a wonderful leader? No, but it makes him a lot better leader, in my opinion, than what we had before. Upon its fallen trunk, all the birds of the sky nest, and all the beasts of the field lodge among its boughs. See, they don't care anymore. They're like, well, you're not great. I'm still going to take whatever I can get from you, but don't think I'm going to come honor you anymore. So that no trees by water should exalt themselves in stature or set their tops among the leafy trees, and that no well-watered tree may reach up to them in height. For they are all consigned to death, to the lowest parts of the netherworld, together with human beings who descend into the pit. Your nation is going to the grave. I believe a prophet I believe if Ezekiel lived today, he would have come to the United States and would have delivered this message. He would have said, your nation is going to the grave. Our nation, not the nation Israel, our political nation, our country is going to the grave. And it's because we have behaved as a people just as the people of Mitzrayim behaved. Thus said Yehovah Elohim on the day it went down to Sheol, the grave, I closed the deep over it and covered it. I held back its streams, and the great waters were checked. I made Lebanon mourn deeply for it, and all the trees of the field languished on its account. I made nations quake at the crash of its fall when I cast it down to Sheol with those who descended into the pit, and all the trees of Eden, the choicest and best of Lebanon, all that were well watered, were consoled in the lowest part of the netherworld. They didn't just fall, they fell as deep as can go. They also descended with it into Sheol, to those slain by the sword, together with its supporters, they who had lived under its shadow among the nations. Now you know who is comparable to you in glory and greatness among the trees of Eden. We began the prophecy with the question, who was comparable to you? He says, now you know who is comparable in glory and greatness among the trees of Eden. And the now you know is implied, but I believe it's a correct translation. And you too shall be brought down with the trees of Eden to the lowest part of the netherworld. It says, you are not going to escape this because you are Pharaoh. You are not going to escape this because you are part of Pharaoh's horde. You are not going to escape this because you have ever had the favor of men. You are going to suffer this because you had the favor of Elohim and you rejected it. And then he says something that should make every one of us stop and take assessment of who we are and where we are and what we really think was going on here. Because the next thing he says is, you shall lie among the uncircumcised and those slain by the sword. He's speaking to Pharaoh of Mitzrayim and his subjects, his most immediate vassals. And he tells them that their punishment is that they will lie among the uncircumcised and those slain by the sword. Why would they care? If they were Mitzrayim, pure blood Mitzrayim, why would they care that they would lie among the uncircumcised? The only people who would care and see this as an abomination to be buried next to the uncircumcised would be descendants of Abraham. Would be descendants of Yitzhak. Would be descendants of Yaakov. Because at this point, none of the other Abrahamic branches besides the line of Yitzhak and Yaakov would have circumcised their sons anyway. So who was Pharaoh of Mitzrayim at this time? What was his lineage? Who were the subjects, the vassals that he had put in place in other nations? I believe we're looking at the equivalent of Samaritan. the descendants of faithful Jews who broke that one rule and married outside the covenant, who created a bloodline that was mixed, not physically, spiritually. Because we're all of one blood. From Adam down, from Noah down, we're all of one blood. Every person of every nation. But there's a commandment that if I'm in the covenant, I'm not to marry someone outside the covenant, or my children will grow up not knowing whether or not they belong in the covenant. So how did someone who would care whether or not he was lying with the circumcised or the uncircumcised, how would he possibly come to any kind of power to be Pharaoh or a vassal of the Pharaoh and be punished along with Mitzrayim? Except that somewhere in his ancestry he had Israelites who were observant Jews, Israelim who were Yahudim. And on his other line, he had Goyim. And when it came down to the moment of choice, he didn't know whether or not he belonged in that covenant, and the covenant with Mitzrayim sounded a whole lot better. When I warn those of you who are not married, and everybody in this room besides me is unmarried, when I warn you, don't even think about dating in the world. When I say don't say, I'm just going to buy her dinner, it doesn't really matter if she's a believer. Or, I just think he's a lot of fun to be with. It doesn't matter whether he's a believer. I'm not going to marry him. We were talking to a lady the other night. She said she tells all of her kids, but specifically her daughter, she was talking about, before you ever go out with a guy, ask yourself, is this one somebody I can see myself being married to? And the world would laugh at that. The world laughs at that, but we have to take it seriously. Because if their beliefs are not in line with yours, someone's going to compromise. And either they're going to hate you eventually for trying to change their beliefs, or you're going to hate yourself for changing yours. Every time. And she says she tells her kids, you never know if this first date will be your last first date, because her husband, she started dating when she was 17, and 6 months later, I think she said it was, maybe less than that, 3 months later. 3 months later, they were engaged. And now they have, 6 children? 5 children? 4 biological, and then 4 biological and 2 they've raised. And I don't believe you could give better advice. My father-in-law used to tell his children, specifically his daughters, but all of his children have heard this. If you don't hang around with an unsaved person, you won't become friends with that unsaved person. You won't start having feelings for that unsaved person. You won't date that unsaved person. You won't marry that unsaved person, and you won't live in misery. I don't know that there were ever wiser words said on the subject. But you could marry an unsaved person, and you could have a son, and he could be Pharaoh of Mitzrayim and descend into the netherworld. Such shall be the fate of Pharaoh and all his hordes, declares Yehovah Elohim. How many of his hordes? All. What does all mean when we're reading scripture? And people say, well, it doesn't really mean, and yet it all means all, and that's all means. Okay? I'm trying to think of the name of the preacher I heard say that. He was a Southern Baptist. He was president of the Southern Baptist Convention at the time, and I cannot think of his name. But he used to say that. And he would say that because it would say, and all of this and this and all of this, and people would say, there are two sides. All of these things hadn't happened, but people were saying that the prophecy was fulfilled. Or, you know, it's not really going to be all that are punished for this. And every time he would say, all means all, and that's all means. And all of his hordes. Pharaoh and all of his hordes. So that doesn't mean that he had 10 guys working for him, and one of them, well, he was just faithful enough to the covenant with Elohim, and just not quite faithful enough to the covenant with Mitzrayim, and that guy got spared. We can't stand. We can't start on the fence. We can't stand on the line. We can't be of the kingdom and of the world. We're commanded to be in the world, but not of the world. Okay? We're in the world so that they see something different. We're not of the world so that we live like them. If we're living like them, then we're choosing not to be in his covenant. And that's as simple. I mean, there's no plainer way to say it. Midrash? Yes, brother.
That's all means all, and that's all means God. And that's all God. Okay, so I was thinking, you said Southern Baptist. Anyway, look at that. So, is it unthinkable that Pharaoh was, I mean, obviously I agree with you, that he was in Israel, or, you know,
Have some
level, but is it unthinkable that because you had said that no one would care about Israel about being lying on him and circumcised, but the sons of Ishmael were circumcised, and
yes, but by
circumcision as well.
But by this time period, from what we can tell, by the time this was written, they weren't circumcising anymore.
They weren't.
I
thought they still did.
They do today. They do today if they are Muslim. Okay? But Islam brought that back in like the 600s AD.
So yeah. My thought was even if the Pharaoh isn't descended from him, is it unthinkable that some of his servant kings were of the 12 sons of Israel?
Oh, absolutely.
Assyria, where they died with Pharaoh.
Yeah, I'm sure if the vassal king of Assyria was Assyrian, then yeah, he was probably descended from Ishmael.
Okay.
So, and it doesn't name any of the other vassals, but you have to think that whole Middle Eastern region up there is pretty much Ishmael.
I'm thinking like they probably ruled like this Arabian Peninsula, you know, which some of the sons of Ishmael went to. So I believe.
Very good. Other questions?